Okay. What time? 6 a.m. I will be here at 4 a.m. I'll be boiling up a big cauldron of scones for all of you. That's how they made it back in the old country. You put scone, you put like flour, sugar, salt, 4 pounds each.
No.
Salt adds to the texture.
And then you swap it out like.
And then you don't even do that. You just dump it all into water, boiling cauldron chicken broth. And then add 6 pounds of sugar and then frosting. Generic frosting. You boil it for 6 days, scones. That's how I used to make it when I was a kid. You guys got it easy. Oh, I'm starting to feeling the grain as we speak. 6 p.m. I'll try to open up that door as a plan. When's the next review day? What time?
6:30.
So I am giving you my time to go through as many things as possible. I will give you opportunities for a few points on a couple other things. If you're there, you will not get that opportunity if you're not there. And I do know. And one more thing, Thursday of next week, you have to come in one period to take a practice test. What periods can you come in? First? Yeah. And you do it. That's the big thing is we sit and get every time, boom, get that done, move on. We'll do a practice test on Wednesday and Thursday. Yeah.
What time will yours open?
I'm looking about 5:45 or so, but I got to talk to probably Mr. Santo about the key situation and stuff, and ask him what he wants me to do about blocking doors. That's the problem with it, but in front, it's very obvious that it's open. That's far away. Okay, so where do we finish here? Well, we got right here, right? Did I guess right? Yeah. No formal training. What said communism is indivisible, had the domino effect, everything led by the Kremlin. What is that called? Yeah, the Truman Doctrine, and that would take what kind of politics forever? Domestic. Politics within the United States would never be the same. No politician could afford to look what? Yeah, soft on communism. Look weak. And the definition just kept then ratcheting up. What? You don't want to make 1,000 atomic bombs? You're soft on communism. You don't want to destroy the world 1,000 times? You're soft on communism. I'm not exaggerating. It just became a measure of how much you're willing to do and build and perhaps even intervene. And yeah, I want to be clear about it. There was a definite lack of courage in a lot of this. What? Oh, we'll come back to this. What will create the Department of Defense, the CIA, National Security Agency? What act would do this? Yeah, the National Security Act. And basically the president can operate in what from now on? Oh. What's that? We could do war without declaration of war. Presidential power went up, but they basically established what kind of government? Yeah, shadow or secret government. And that's by necessity. Spies have got to be in secret, but how quickly did they abuse that? Really quick. And every president did. Where was the blockade? Say it again. Yeah, Berlin. I just didn't. And what did the West try to create? Their own what? They created West Germany by creating a what? Yeah, the mark. You make your own currency, you collect taxes in it, you've created a country. And so with that, it's over. So we got to this, and one of the big victories for conservative Republicans and Democrats, we're talking about conservative, the concepts of the New Deal, they weakened the Wagner Act. with the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. So make sure you put down weaken the Wagner Act. It basically made it more difficult to organize unions. One of the biggies is it banned sit-down strikes. Just notice you're on paper. And Truman vetoed this, but they overrode it. So even though the Republicans, they had a very tiny majority, a lot of conservative Democrats joined with them. Conservatives anti-union, and this would begin to erode labor unions. Laws for forming union became much more restrictive, and in the 1980s, membership in unions began to tumble like a rock. A very anti-union president, Ronald Reagan, took power, and it just began to tumble like a rock. And it really depends on what side you're on, what you believe about wages. Yeah.
Don't think you.
Oh, did I not say this?
Yeah.
So Republicans did really well in the 1946 midterm elections and took slight majorities in the House and the Senate. And Republicans had not had the majority in the House and the Senate since 1930. And also did well in a lot of state elections where Democrats had controlled most states. A lot of this was anger over inflation. A lot of it was just Democrats been in power in a long time. There's a lot of people who kind of in the margin who vote are like, oh, I'm tired of them. I'll vote for somebody else for whatever reason. That view always kind of amuses and terrifies me. Yeah.
Also, but what exactly?
We have a midterm election right now. So
Yeah.
presidential elections are 4 years. So every 4 years, they call that election the presidential election. And so what that means, the president is up for re-election, every member of the House and a third of the members of the Senate. But since members of the House are elected every 2 years, in between the presidential elections, they call it a midterm of the 4-year term of the president. It's just one of those things. Yeah. And so like this 2022, every member of the House will be up for election and a third of the members of the Senate in 2022. Same thing. And the party in power always does. Whoever's elected president, who's ever elected president, 2 years later, that his party has always been a he so far, has always done poorly. Always. Some really bad, some fairly bad. Always. It's just a trend. So with that, so in the election of 1948, everybody assumed that Truman would lose. That Truman even offered to step down because he actually wanted to be back in the Senate. He actually offered it to Dwight Eisenhower. Would you want to run for president? Eisenhower, who had never really voted, didn't know what party he was, said, no, I'm going to stay in Europe. Eisenhower would later on decide, I'm a Republican, but that's coming later. And so Truman would get the nomination by default. But Truman was the type of guy where he's going to fight. So once he decided, okay, I'm it, he's going to go. And his program was called the Fair Deal. Sound familiar? Yeah. Square, new, fair. This is the last of the deals. And this would try basically to do what the third New Deal did, to finish it. 3 prongs. The first one, education. So the GI Bill provided education for veterans. This would provide tuition-free education for whatever the school might be, for public schools, for all Americans. And also a huge aid for public education at the local level. There was no federal aid for education back then. And so that was the plan. Yeah, but remember, they did this in that was Roosevelt's attempt in the third New Deal, which never happened because of court packing and the Roosevelt recession. Next, some kind of national health insurance. It would be run out of the Social Security Administration, and it would probably be some kind of thing where there would still be private hospitals or publicly owned hospitals, but the insurance to pay for it would come through the federal government. So something closer to what Canada has. Ironically, Britain, or not ironically, literally this same year did their national health service to nationalize the entire healthcare system. Now, the whole thing is run by the British government. That would be in 1948 too. This was not it. but the big thing about healthcare, and this was really noticeable by the 30s, but into the 40s because of antibiotics, just invented at the end of the 1930s, it was working. People were surviving. And so it became like, oh, yeah, you go to the hospital, you have a disease, you might live. And this became like revolutionary and shockingly expensive. And those go hand in hand. People cannot afford, most people can't afford healthcare just on the fly. That's why insurance, whole idea of pulling money together. We have private insurance for most workers, myself included. That's since it come out in the 1950s. But that's why he wanted that. And lastly, civil rights. Why I put down the military there is by executive order, and that newspaper article has that. Truman desegregated the armed forces. So there were still separate units in the armed forces. Truman, by order, which previous law gave him the power to do that, desegregated it, and now he wanted to end Jim Crow. And this was a Southern Democrat. So a lot of people, a lot of Southern Democrats saw him as a traitor. And he did it before an election. So Truman had definite political courage, even though you guys could argue awful late for this, especially since you're fighting the Nazis. And he wanted also for the right to vote. And this is important to look at the Democratic Party, how it was shifting. Southern Democrats were, of course, pro-Jim Crow. They want to make sure that poor people, and especially poor Black people, could not vote. All poor people didn't want to vote. That's why they have poll taxes or things like that. But because of Roosevelt's New Deal, remember they desegregated said no discrimination in the WPA and no discrimination in any kind of arms manufacturing. That meant that at least Northern African Americans who could vote, at least some could vote, they became more democratic, and that's pushing the party. And so he came out with a strong civil rights plank that Democrats had never had. And Republicans had, but hadn't really pushed it since you could argue the presidency of James Garfield. And so with that, Southern Democrats left. They walked out. And here they are, and you'll know it, or here they are walking out. They took off. And there's the old flag of Mississippi. They literally had just added the Confederate battle flag to it in opposition to the chance of civil rights. And so they walked out. This should remind you of something. Remember 1860? Southern Democrats split Douglas and Breckinridge. And so you can imagine who's overjoyed. Republicans are like, all we got to do is run somebody who's alive. And we should win. Just don't screw up. Because remember, Abraham Lincoln was unknown, and he was elected in 1860 because the Democrats were split. And much like 1860, the Democrats were the majority party. It seemed, most people would have said they're Democrats. Now we got them. They formed their own party, one term, they called it the States' Rights Party. And much like states' rights was code for pro-slavery, it was code for Jim Crow laws, segregation. They also dubbed themselves the Dixiecrats, and they would nominate Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina, the segregationist governor of South Carolina, Democrat from South Carolina. The Dixiecrats, you should remember this too. Those were the former Confederates who took power in the former Confederacy during presidential reconstruction of Andrew Johnson. I hope when I said those things, like, oh, I kind of remember that. The Dixiecrats, that was also called the old Confederates who took power in the former Confederacy during presidential reconstruction. They called themselves Dixiecrats back in 1865. So there's a lot of meaning behind this. And they dusted off the Confederate battle flag, which was the symbol of the lost cause, and now it turned into the symbol for states' rights or segregation. That's why there's a very complex history of the Confederate battle flag. They did it for a reason. This goes back to the lost cause. Remember the lost cause after the Civil War and after Reconstruction? Hopefully that's like, oh, I remember that. I know. One of the problems with a class like this, there are a lot of stuff. That's why we got to do the review list. That's why I reward you. But I help you. I'm making you scones as we speak. In 1964, he would make a very, it was, I can't even describe what a big deal it was. He became a senator, and he left the Democratic Party and became a Republican. And would begin this wave of Southern Democrats leaving over civil rights. And that's coming down the road. It's called the Southern Strategy. It would be shockingly effective for Republicans, but that's coming later. You don't need to write this down, but if there's any question of what Strom Thurmond felt, this is what he said in Charleston when he gave the nominating address. Yes, of course, it's Charleston. If there's any doubt what he stood for. So no, don't forget, racism came out of Bacon's Rebellion in economics. But now, by this, it's really dividing. It's really divisive. And Harry, Henry, and Dewey, phooey. For some reason that makes me laugh. And that's their convention. They're holding up a picture of Robert E. Lee. They really showed the Democrats were split. And then they were split again. Those who thought the New Deal weren't going far enough, they rallied around the old progressive ticket. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive in 1912, the Bull Moose Party. And they nominated former Secretary of the Interior and also Roosevelt's second vice president, Henry Wallace. He was run out by Southern Democrats in 44. That's why they picked Truman as a compromise. Boy, that's what they felt so betrayed by Truman. He thought the New Deal wasn't going far enough. He also thought the Cold War might blow the world up. He thought they're going too far with the Truman Doctrine. Now, he also thought Stalin wasn't that bad of a guy. So he was clearly wrong about that. Yes, I'm biased against Stalin. But this shows how kind of on the left, it's three different voices now. Wallace, Truman, and Thurman. Or like the Democrats, divided three different ways. With Thurman, Truman, and Wallace. And so Thomas Dewey, the Republican governor, former district attorney of New York City, he's best known for running down famous mobsters like Lucky Luciano. He ran against and lost against Roosevelt in 44. He looked like he's going to be the perfect nominee. But he is a liberal Republican. He accepted most of the New Deal. More conservative Republicans, led by a man by the name of William Taft. Remember William Howard Taft, who was president? His son was a senator from Ohio. They were furious that they picked this more liberal, pro-New Deal Republican. But kind of the Eastern Republican establishment pushed them in. Same thing happened in 52. They'd be furious about Eisenhower. And they called him like he looked like the little man on the wedding cake, which always kind of makes me laugh. He never said much, never smiled, competent politician, ran a non-campaign because everybody thought they would win. 3 weeks before the election, there was a poll done by Gallup. He still does polls. And there was the last major poll. It took a long time back then to do a poll. And they had Dewey winning in a sweep. In fact, their prediction was Dewey would win 333 electoral votes to 83. It would be a Republican landslide nationwide. And so everybody thought this cartoon shows this. Just thought it'd be a blowout with the Democrats split. And here's Dewey saying to Truman, what's the use of going through the election? I mean, everybody thought this. And so the polls, a Dewey landslide. The only person who didn't believe that, oh yeah, and now here to talk about the election in Miller. Fire inspection.
Yeah, just looking for electrical.
Most of you, look at that. Okay, so where was I? Oh, the only person who thought Dewey or I thought Truman would win, was Truman. Truman understood the popularity of the New Deal. And once you got outside the big cities, Truman was incredibly popular. And so they did a whistle stop campaign. This is the last campaign before television. In fact, the two conventions, the Democratic and Republican conventions, were the first conventions they broadcast on the brand new media television. Just a few places you can watch the convention. In fact, the conventions were cool. Now they're kind of boring, cheerleading fest. But, okay, that's my personal opinion, but I don't think I'm in the minority. So he would give these whistle stop speeches. He was not a very good speaker, but he could give kind of a rip roaring speech, get people yelling. And he would say, we're not going to go back to the 1920s. We're not going to go back to trickle down economics. Truman said this.
Okay, I was gonna say.
Yeah, so Truman said, we're not going to go back to that time. And are we relatively safe?
You are. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Well done.
I know it's good they do that, but it's always got to play. I'm giving like. And then of course I have to say, here to talk about the election. All right, so he would be this, and we can't allow those malefactors of wealth to take power. Hey, people remember the Great Depression, so they didn't want to go back. It's one of the things where memory fades, but back then it was very real. And then somebody in the audience, almost always planned, would scream out, "Give him hell, Harry!" And he said, "If you send me back, I will." And everybody would scream. It's this train it was called the Ferdinand Magellan residential train. I just think that's an awesome name. But he went through Montana, stopping every little town. The last of the old style campaigns. Actually, old style campaign. They only campaigned like that for about 50 years. And then television will come and. But it would turn out to be the biggest political upset in American history, at least arguably up to relatively recent times. Nobody thought Truman would win. And not only Truman win, he won big. And the Democrats won big. This was a huge victory nationwide. Now, you'll notice one thing, even though there were very close elections, the Northeast was still it was pretty heavily Republican, a little more liberal Republican, but heavily Republican. And you see this? For the first time since Reconstruction, southern states did not vote for a Democrat. And this would begin kind of the chink in the armor of the solid Democratic South that would blow up in 1964. And yeah, 2016, nobody thought President Trump would win. In fact, it was clear Clinton was making campaign decisions like they're going to win a big landslide. And obviously it was razor thin electoral, razor thin, and Clinton won the popular vote, but Trump won. That might be as big of a political upset because nobody expected. I don't think even President Trump was probably a little bit surprised. It was, yeah. Truman wasn't. The Chicago Tribune was a very Republican newspaper, and they wanted to get this headline out, so they printed it at about 10 o'clock that night, so they could get it out in the morning. This full, the big victory for Dewey, and so Truman, of course, would take this picture, and loved it. But after this, the gloves are going to come off. Dewey never used, as a point of pride, he was being pushed to do this. Say Truman stopped on communism. And you're like, well, I can't. First off, I don't want to be controversial. I'm going to win anyways. But also the Berlin crisis is going on. But after that, the gloves came. And they immediately start to red bait President Trump. Almost immediately. Now, would it have been successful? A little bit. If these two things would not have happened. The two shocks of 49. And with it, killed the fair deal. Remember those three things? They did not happen. Because it gave power to conservatives, mostly Southern Democrats, and most Republicans. Some liberal Republicans wanted this. The ideological divide was not was still pretty vague on parties. A lot of it was still regional, other issues. There's still a huge ideological divide in the Democrats, not as much as in the Republicans, but you still see that. So here is this Iron Curtain, and I like the Bear Grove. I just thought this was funny. The shocks and the two. It came near the end of 49. Oh, I should have one more thing about the fair deal. Southern Democrats are very anti-union, and one of the reasons is if you have a union of both white workers and black workers, this could cause, well, a little bit of issue with their power. Okay? So they were relatively anti-union. That's why they were against they were for Taft-Hartley. And the idea of healthcare. Or education. And that's one of the big reasons why that didn't pass. Or you could argue that would have been a good thing or a bad thing, but that's why. One of the big reasons they voted against. And it does go against trickle-down economics. Number one, Joe won. Now that's what the U.S. Code named it. 1949, October. Well, an American B-29 bomb was flying at about 60,000 feet. It was reading the effects of radiation from previous U.S. tests in the Pacific. Got in the atmosphere. They're trying to figure out how long it would stay in the atmosphere. We're doing all kinds of high altitude tests. We're also launching balloons that went up like 100,000 feet to test radiation. Balloons, like these weird silver balloons that have tape with weird writing on them. Some landed near this place called Roswell. That's another story. Time. That's what we're talking about special topics, the Roswell thing. But back to this. They found unusual amounts of radiation that could only. Somebody exploded a bomb. Britain was working on their bomb, so was France, but they hadn't exploded it. That could mean only one thing. The Soviets have exploded their bomb. And this is a mock-up. This is the second bomb with a Soviet physicist, but it was an exact copy of the Trinity bomb, which was the same bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And all of a sudden now, the United States, still fearful of the mighty Soviet army, but we still felt relatively invulnerable. The clunky Russians are 10 years away. Sure, they're brave, but they don't have the technology we have. Now we're vulnerable. And that's where you start getting civil defense to prepare for bombing missions. And this was given at the end, how to survive a nuclear attack. Now we are vulnerable. Yes, I grew up with these. Remember how to build a fallout shelter in your backyard. Remember that. You dig a trench, 12 feet or about 10 feet wide, a trench, and then you put a door covered with dirt and cover yourself up, and you stand there for 2 weeks. You miss that fun. Gosh darn it. You miss the fun of nuclear tests. Yes, I did duck and cover. Maybe after the exam, I will tell you one drill we have. But here's the thing. There were spies. Klaus Fuchs was a Bulgarian physicist who fled fascism. He went to Britain. Britain farmed him off to Los Alamos to work on the U.S. bomb. He was actually back in Britain in 49 working on their bomb. Please be careful spelling his name. Well, Fuchs was a spy. And the United States had broken the Soviet wartime code in 48. So they were reading all these messages from 41 to 45. And they saw, transmitted over, the plans and his name. And so they told the British he was a spy. The British, absolutely embarrassed, had him arrested. They did about a 5-minute trial. He was convicted of espionage. He's still actually the most dangerous type of spy. He was a true believer. He sincerely believed that fascism would probably take over. And so Stalin needed a bomb as the only way to protect civilization. He believed Stalin was creating this kind of idealized socialist state, not the monstrous totalitarian state that he actually was. If a spy's doing it for money, I mean, that's bad, but you know, they could be turned very easily. Not a guy like this. And so now they had the bomb.
And this triggered an hysteria looking for spies because he looks just like everybody else, doesn't he? Just a guy. And so they started rooting out spies, looking for spies, doing loyalty tests, you name it. And then another person who probably did commit a little bit of espionage, who worked on the Manhattan Project, Julius Rosenberg, he was arrested along with his wife Ethel. And in the hysteria of looking for spies and the absolute panic that just brewed up overnight, they were both condemned and executed in the electric chair, even though there was absolutely no evidence that Ethel Rosenberg was involved at all in espionage. She probably knew and kept her mouth shut, which is a crime. But to give you the idea of the absolute fear, the US was not at war with the Soviet Union, and yet they executed them both. There's a headline of that. And they probably didn't send over any information that they didn't already know. Yes, there's no doubt Julius was a spy, but that gives you the idea of the absolute terror of spies. So there are communists within, an enemy within. And then, I can't emphasize that enough, that total war thinking. They've already did a National Security Act. That's why the FBI would just start wiretapping people. It's actually kind of shocking. Boom, everybody came into suspicion. That's when the Pledge of Allegiance started becoming mandated. We got to prove you're not a communist. And you start seeing people doing loyalty tests, signing loyalty oaths. It became almost farcical, the idea that a communist could not sign a loyalty oath. And then Red China, or called the People's Republic of China. So there had been a civil war in China most of the first half of the 20th century. Well, it kind of devolved by the 1930s to probably the leading warlord. He actually kind of started out as a socialist, but basically became a dictator wannabe, called the nationalists, or the Kuomintang, under Chiang Kai-shek. There's Chiang Kai-shek. And then the communists, who were always smaller, but much more organized. And they were agrarian, they were farmers, but they were going to create this industrial world under Mao Zedong, right here. And they fought a guerrilla war against the nationalists. And then Mao Zedong fought a guerrilla war against the Japanese. During World War II, the United States aided them both, but sent 20 times more to Chiang Kai-shek. And he pocketed a lot of it. In fact, by 48, Truman had cut back on funding because Chiang Kai-shek was making himself a millionaire on American aid. And even though his army was 10 times the size of the communists after World War II, they weren't doing very well. And so going into 49, Truman was very reluctant to give aid. And then in September and October, it happened literally, it's like that. The nationalists collapsed and the communists won. Just boom, just gone. The army just dissolved. Men deserted, joined the communists. Chiang Kai-shek fled with some cronies, a few other people, and a lot of money to this island called Formosa, which was a Japanese colony. And then China got it back, but it's really vague. They kicked out most of the Formosans and created Taiwan, or as we called it then, Good China, the Republic of China. And then on the mainland was the People's Republic, or as everybody in the United States or Western Europe called it, Red China. When I was growing up, it was Red China under Mao Zedong. And they at first tried to create this communist state and got rid of classes, and then it devolved into totalitarianism. But to this day, there are still two Chinas. To this day. And so remember the United Nations. The United Nations, what body in the UN makes all the important decisions? The Security Council. There were 11 members then, now there's 15. There are 5 permanent members with a veto. Do you remember what those permanent members are? US, France, Britain, Soviets, and China. Which China? There's 2 Chinas. Well, the United States would not allow the People's Republic, the most populous country in the world. And so up until 1979, Taiwan had that seat. China was not even in the United Nations. And then literally overnight it switched. The US wanted to open up trade with China and various things, also part of the Cold War. So Taiwan is not considered a country. In fact, Taiwan cannot call themselves an independent country. The United States does not have an embassy there. We do not recognize them as a country. There are two Chinas. And if anybody says that Taiwan is an independent country, Beijing goes absolutely bonkers. And they have threatened to invade. In fact, they were threatening to invade this summer. And that's part of the reason why China has been very lukewarm about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because they want to get Taiwan. And since it's gone so poorly for the Russians, they realize the effectiveness of modern missiles, that might be out. But that's what it was today. In fact, Russia boycotted the United Nations up until 1951 over this. And so this Cold War over China. But back to domestic politics. Who's going to be blamed? In fact, they said, who lost China? That became the cry. Because remember Truman doctrine thinking. Truman said, all communist revolts are led by what man? Stalin. And here they are together. As it turned out, they were rivals and didn't like each other at all. We now know today that Stalin actually would have preferred Chiang Kai-shek because he could deal with him. He didn't trust Mao. But to Truman doctrine thinking, they're sweeping in and taking in China. Who lost it? Now, this is implying that America had China to lose. But who was blamed? The sitting president and the party in power, the Democrats. Truman was either an imbecile and lost China, or he was either a communist or a communist sympathizer. What did they call it? Somebody who sympathized with the communists? That's close to pink. Yeah, it is pink. Pinko. And Democrats piled on. Truman's going to be blamed for this. And so this is one of the maps. Look at the blob. The red blob is growing, implying the communists are winning and the West doesn't have a chance. But don't forget, the United States is so much stronger than anybody else in the world. It's not even close. But we begin to feel we're losing. And here's Mao on time. He said the communist revolution will be like 1,000 locusts. So you notice the red grasshoppers. I like that. So overnight, everyone's going to look tough. And Truman asked for more military spending. And the United States began an arms buildup. Now, it's not going to happen until 51 by plan. Already started the draft, National Security Act, and now it looks like we're kind of at war. And we're fearful of communists everywhere, and it's no coincidence. Just 4 months after the People's Republic of China won, Red China, in Wheeling, West Virginia, an unknown junior senator from Wisconsin, who is considered to be the worst senator in the United States Senate, mostly, but not only, because of his drunkenness, Joe McCarthy, here we go, right here, would give a series of speeches. Joe McCarthy in 1950, yeah, he was a raging alcoholic, kind of infamous for this. The junior senator from Wisconsin, Wheeling, West Virginia, and he got up with a rolled up piece of paper and said, I have in my hand a list of 205 communists running the State Department. That is right here. You see Wheeling welcomes Wisconsin junior senator. So senators would go on these little trips as a way to kind of make money. You know, they get paid for it, kind of under the table. It wasn't quite illegal then. It happens now, but it's technically illegal. It was a Lincoln Day celebration for Republicans. He gave this speech. Nobody really paid attention. McCarthy was kind of a joke, but it was a slow day. And think about it. A year earlier, this would have just been an accusation. Would have been, oh yeah, it's kind of nut. Now, How else can we explain Joe won? How else can we explain how they won in China? The communists seem to be winning. How else do we explain the spies? It must be true. It must be true. And hit the newspapers on Sunday and went nationwide. Soon he'd have this cheap little paperback book out, claimed he wrote it, didn't write it. And then he went to Las Vegas and gave another speech. Oh, I almost have. Since it seemed true, he played on people's fears, which is the classic demagoguery. Now, don't forget, there were spies. But he just made up a number. Ironically, you know that wadded a piece of paper? You know what it was? It was a betting form for horse racing. He was doing illegal gambling on horses. And that was his betting form. He just had it in his pocket and pulled it out and said, I got a list of 205. And then he went to Las Vegas on the same kind of speaking tour, and the number dropped to 57 communists. So you could argue a victory against the communists, we got rid of almost 150 of them. This should tell you one very important thing. He had no idea. In fact, a bunch of reporters asked him, can we see the list? And he went like, let me look and find it. I've lost the list. And then he went on the floor of the United States Senate and gave two names of people that were suspected of communism without proof. And so you could argue this victory against communist incursion, or he's making it up. But reporters just followed him around and he just ate it up. He gave him like a rock star. Just unbelievable. All these people came out to see him. And this kind of bumbling man, not a great, didn't give a good speech, but he sounded very sincere. And this would begin what we call McCarthyism. And McCarthyism exploded as the most effective way to attack. This is red baiting. I should have a lot of Democrats join right in. And of course, they're going to attack Republicans, but Democrats, some Republicans, but here's McCarthy attacking the Democratic nominee for president in 52. Adlai Stevenson is a communist. He was the governor of Illinois. But don't forget, and I can't emphasize this is enough, it was a back channel way to destroy the New Deal. The New Deal was still really popular. A lot of more conservative trickle-down economic style people didn't like the New Deal, but they didn't want to attack it directly, but say the people who are for it are communists. Unfortunately, that is a very effective way, I say unfortunately, because it kind of avoids the issue and it gets people really scared. So all it took were accusations, and he just would throw out accusations, accusing anybody of being a communist. Throw them, quick as he can. Accuse people of being communists. And if you're accused, your life was destroyed. Lost your job, just done. Both parties were scared. Truman actually ran pretty scared, even though Truman knew it was garbage. There's no evidence of any of this. Don't forget though, there were some spies, but he was not accusing anybody who was actually a spy of being a spy. At the same time, the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was originally created to stop fascists back in 1937, they jumped in. Now they started in 47. This was under Republicans, and then even picked up under Democrats. Democrats were scared to oppose it. But Republicans can attack Democrats here. And I should add, and I don't want to emphasize this enough, it's because Republicans were in the minority. Democrats would do it to President Eisenhower and Vice President Nixon in 1960. So this very distasteful politics would just accelerate. And they really went after Hollywood, and the radio industry was just growing. And remember what I told you, television is like literally just on the edge. So here's implying the communist influence in radio and television, that's from 51. Those who refused to name names of people they might have gone to meetings of socialists or anybody were charged with contempt and blacklisted and never worked again. I was just reading about Dorothy Parker, who was a famous writer and screenwriter who was blacklisted. Kind of her career was destroyed. Here are some of the most famous actors in Hollywood. Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart, Danny Kaye's right there. At some of these hearings, most gave in. They just accepted it. And so this hysteria began. But we have to end it right here. Jump right here. But in 52, I was elected. Eisenhower's a Republican. And Republicans are like, okay, Joe, don't attack the administration anymore. But he liked it because people were covering him. He kept attacking, especially in 54, he attacked the United States Army. Eisenhower was a 5-star general. So this is a direct attack on a Republican president. So this shows you what type of guy McCarthy is. He just was an opportunist. And eventually, unfounded attacks, here's part of it. This is the Defense Department's lawyer, Robert Welch, right here. Just like, geez. They're making up stories about the Army being controlled by communism. But he was finally censured by the United States Senate. And in 1954, I think I have a picture right here, or 57, I'm sorry, his liver literally exploded from alcoholism. It was something like 5 times the size of a normal liver. Your livers filter toxins. Alcohol is a poison. And so he died. Pretty young. But the Red Scare continued. You notice I put 88? That would be the last presidential election of the Red Scare. Now, I know the bell's about ready to ring. I thought I'd give myself 1 more minute, but I didn't. I want to show you cute little kids on bikes, right? And that can only mean one thing, right? Let's write a thesis. Get it before the bell rang. Let me know if it's empty on. Yes, I have a contract with the paper. You know the why? What was everybody scared of? That's all you need. That's the why. They were scared of what? And they give you 3 things. Doctrines, acts, action, scares. There's all kinds of stuff. Go back and look at it. Make sure they relate to domestic politics. We're talking about elections and disagreements over policy. Oh, before you go, remind me tomorrow, then I'll quick look at yours, but do you want to see mine? So I know the big thing is why is anti-communism. I pulled it up here because just Truman Doctrine thinking. You know why I did that? Yes, it's anti-communism, but that allowed me also to say, see, I know more stuff. Aren't I smart? Give me a good grade. But if you would put the why is anti-communism, you're in good shape. So I would come a good grade tomorrow, begin the class. Sound good?
Thank you.
Let's go, people.
I did,
Well, I didn't get this.
pretty sure I turned into.
Let me go look for it. Let me jot down. I very well could have just missed it. And one of the problems with the extra credit is, so what am I little cheat? I skipped lines, and I might have just skipped that. But I kind of remember it. And so, let me look at it. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, 'cause I think you did it, so.
And then we
Probably not. You want one?
Not really. Yeah. It's faster if you don't mind.